And Bill, what's coming up?
What a show we have tonight. We may have to go overtime. We have from Radiohead, guitarist Ed O'Brien. This is a coup for us, man. We're so excited to have Ed O'Brien of Radiohead, who has worked on the McCartney III Imagined album, and he'll tell us all about that. We have the great indie band The Head and the Heart, at least two of them, and they're going to talk about their Beatles influence. And we have Grammy-winning singer Pedro Capó. So if that weren't enough, ladies and gentlemen, if that just doesn't sell you, if that doesn't say, I'm not going to watch Walt Disney tonight, I'm going to watch the Beatles channel, we have the Jersey Devil himself, the handsomest man in show business. It's Tom Frangione.
Well, Billy, you're too kind. I'll get your check out tomorrow in the mail as usual. Thank you so much. Guys, I hope you had a wonderful Easter or Passover. We're hoping all our listeners did as well. So back in the saddle tonight for some springtime Beatles. I'm all excited.
And we're about to welcome our first guest for the night. He is a member of one of the most respected, innovative, and successful groups over the last 30-plus years. That would be Radiohead. Take a listen to some of their music. Our first guest tonight is Ed O'Brien, who, along with four fellow classmates from Abingdon School in England, formed the band Radiohead 35 years ago. Their debut single, Creep, in 1992 gave us just a hint of what was to come over the next 9 albums to follow, including landmark recordings like The Bends, OK Computer, and Kid A. And always full of surprises, they actually released their 7th album, In Rainbows, on their own website in 2007, offering it as a free download or a pay-what-you-want release. It went on to become one of their most successful albums to date. Well, last year our guest released his debut solo album, Earth, and was invited by Paul McCartney to reimagine a track from Paul's latest release, McCartney III. We're delighted to welcome Ed O'Brien to the Beatles Fab Forum. Where are we speaking to you on the Beatles Fab Forum this evening?
I am in London, North London, an area of London called Hampstead. And it's the first really sunny, warm day of the year, and the birds are in glorious full voice, and it's lovely to be with you. Bill, I think I might have read a book of yours years ago. Did you write the U2 book?
I did.
I very much enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you very much, Ed. This makes me feel like $1 million.
It was great. It documented the nuttiness of Zoo TV, I seem to remember.
Yeah, the idea was, instead of trying to cover a little bit about somebody's whole career, let's take 2 years and really dig in on it. And it turned out to be a really good 2 years to pick.
Yeah, it was great. Very good reading. I was a very big U2 fan. They were very, like, for me in the 80s, I was a teenager. They were kind of, I guess, them and the Smiths and R.E.M. and Echo and the Bunnymen were my go-to bands. And so, yeah, it was great to read a bit about that.
Ed, it was early last year, and you had put out your first solo debut, Earth, as EOB, and you were about to begin, I think, a promotional tour, and then suddenly it was COVID time, and you, in fact, had COVID early on. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that is. We'd just done a little, very small promo 4-date tour of America. We'd done a show in London. And then the last show we did, and it was all kind of the management like, do you want to go and do this? And I guess we hadn't really worked out how serious COVID was. And also I'm kind of old school. It's kind of like, you never, ever want to cancel a show. And so we did this TV show in Paris, and it's this whole TV show that we did. We were inside for about 12 hours. And I think every single band in that room got COVID. So 3 days later, I got back, and yeah, I had it. And I lost my sense of taste and smell very quickly. But that in Britain, that wasn't reported as being a symptom. So I Googled it, and the New York Times said this is a symptom. So yeah, I had it. In fact, a year ago, I was with it.
but all is well, family as well, everyone's fine?
Yeah, everyone's well. What I would say is that I think in my experience, I had what they called a long tail of COVID. It lasted a long time. I mean, and I think throughout this winter, sort of exhaustion. So, you know, I know there are lots of people, I know there are people who are sort of skeptical about it, and it seems to have different effects on different people. But my experience was I wouldn't want to have that again.
Let's turn to your participation in McCartney III, the reimagined version of the most recent McCartney release. You get, what, a phone call, a text, an email that says, "Hey, we'd like you to do something with this." How does it all happen?
It starts with an email from Arjun at Capitol Records, who's Paul's marketing guy, and he's mine as well. And Arjun said, you know, I don't know if you'd be interested in doing this, but we're asking artists to sort of reimagine and reinterpret and remix and do whatever you want. And it was at a good time. I was actually in the studio. I'd just been sort of starting up the process for the next record and been tinkering around with Paul Epworth, producer Paul Epworth, in his studio in London. And, you know, I heard the track and I was like, which was Slidin. And I was just like, yeah, this feels good. I've never, ever done anything like this before. And I said to Paul Epworth, this is not Paul McCartney, I said to Paul, and Paul had actually worked with Paul McCartney on a previous album. And I said, you know, should we, couple of days, should we have a go at this? And he was like, yeah, let's do it. And I said, yeah, we listened to it and kind of decided how we would proceed with it, which was not to, I guess, because I didn't have a band and we had a very finite time in the studio. I didn't feel like we could reinterpret it with a band and didn't have enough time. So it was more a case of, okay, let's remix this and try and think of it like if Paul McCartney was in the studio with us, if he come to me with this song, what would I be suggesting, or how would I add my flavor to it, really? And it's more like a sort of co-mix, if you like.
Well, it certainly has a different sound, you know, if we put them back to back and then you hear a little of this and a little of that, and then you say, well, okay, it's similar, but it's much more revved up, and we'll let the listener decide just how revved up and different it is. The first thing I noticed, and by the way, were you even given the option of, was it strictly remix it, or did you actually have the option of, if you'd like to add your voice, you could?
Yeah, there was no limits, and Paul was brilliant like that as well. He was like, we got sent the stems of the tracks, and we couldn't get into his vocals, and he came back and he said, you know, be less, be less polite about this. Or what was brilliant, it was, I think, the sort of the more open the better as far as Paul is concerned. So there were no limits whatsoever.
So the first thing I notice as I'm listening is the speed, and then I go back and I look at the timings, and Paul's version is 3 minutes and 23 seconds, and your version is 2 minutes and 39 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard it, I was just like, I want to make this a bit more chaotic, a bit more in your face, a bit rougher. And maybe this will go on to talking about the Beatles. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with, from about the age of 8 to about 11, 12, I was completely obsessed with the Beatles. But for 2 of those years, the first 2 years, on 8 and 10, I was obsessed with the rock and roll stuff. You know, I was obsessed with when Paul's singing Kansas City, or they're playing, George is singing Roll Over Beethoven, John's Twist and Shout. I liked that kind of Hamburg vibe, the rock and roll, the 2 guitars, banging away the drums, lots of cymbals. And actually Paul phoned me up afterwards to thank me. And I said the other thing I thought, wanted a bit of that, but I was kind of wanted a bit of the Helter Skelter vibe, you know? bit more, add a bit of psychedelia in there as well. Add a bit of kind of, so it's not just kind of, you know, straight ahead rock and roll. I wanted to add a bit of like few nutty sounds, a bit of, you know, a bit trippy, really. So the rock and roll Beatles kind of stuff, and also particularly Helter Skelter, obviously off the White Album, was kind of like, that's the kind of vibe that I wanted, something a bit more kind of trashy and in your face.
And that totally succeeds. I mean, as I'm listening to it, I'm thinking Helter Skelter, and then I'm thinking, well, all right, that seems to be the way, but I'm not quite sure. And Radiohead has a lot of thickness in its music. I almost sense like you took a melody and you added texture and you just made it thicker. The steel just got much thicker.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, particularly my role in Radiohead traditionally has been a sort of, you know, I've done, you know, obviously riffs as a guitarist, but also the thing that I've always liked to try and do is like, for a song, if you like, frame it within a sound. And that often is textural stuff. That's often done through delay, reverb, maybe sustained notes, and adding kind of, yeah, you know, we've been very lucky in Radiohead that often, you know, you're presented with a very strong melody to begin with. So sometimes it's good to add other melodies that sort of weave in and out of that. But other times you don't want to detract from that melody. And the job is a lot more subtle, but to try and put that melody in a different space, if you see what I mean, you know, and that's where it's not necessarily what you notice first of all, but you can sort of put that melody in different spaces.
Well, I think this is the moment, Ed, when we should let our listeners hear just what you did. Let's hear a little bit of Paul McCartney's version of Slidin', and then we'll hear the Ed O'Brien remix. So that is Slidin' as reimagined by Ed O'Brien of Radiohead from Paul McCartney's McCartney III album. Ed, you know, it kind of sounds like you put a little Led Zeppelin on McCartney too, as well as Helter Skelter.
Well, we love Zeppelin, don't we? I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of Led Zeppelin, not only the rock stuff, but I mean, you won't hear the pastoral. I love the pastoral stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, it's a kind of classic British rock blues thing, isn't it?
And I assume you doubled that guitar.
Yeah, and then I also did some real kind of basic, just, you know, basic rhythm stuff. That's kind of, I think what's interesting, what happens when you record bands. One of the things that I always like, for me, great recordings are slightly, you know, you're not everybody's completely on the beat. Sometimes there's just a little bit before and after, and that gives it so much quality. So I literally was just like, I don't want to swear, so I'll try and find, let's mess this up a little bit and just do a kind of like a no-brainer kind of just guitar part. And it's funny because it just adds a kind of a dynamic. But what I will say is what was amazing about doing this track was everything that, I mean, Paul plays everything. You know, he plays the drums, he sings. And for me, what was extraordinary was when we were allowed to get into those vocal stems, suddenly we were able to unravel the different takes that he'd done. And the one that we used was one that had sort of been a little bit squashed in his original version. But I pulled it out, and for me, I thought it's just extraordinary. You can still hear that young man who was a fan of Little Richard, who sang Oh Darling, who sang Kansas City, who sang, you know, it's got this incredible power. And, you know, he's in his 70s and he's doing that. So I was just like, Paul and I were like, we've got to get this vocal louder. That's got to be our lead one, because that for me is like, he's really going for it. It's brilliant.
Well, I have to say that was a real surprise, because the McCartney version of the track, the version that he released, has a very raw kind of, you know, I just rolled out of bed in the morning, vocal on it, and to find out that there was that other, shaking the rafters vocal underneath. Were there any other surprises in the multi-tracks? Were there any other surprises in the stems? Any accordions hidden in there or anything?
No, I think there was. I think his drumming. When we spoke on the phone afterwards, I complimented on his drumming, and it's obviously great. Obviously, he's one of the greatest ever bass players ever. So no, it was all just brilliant. I think it's interesting. It's really interesting because what it shows you as well sometimes when people work on their own, and he did this with his engineer. Sometimes, I reckon if he was in a band situation or he was with other people, or maybe someone would have got that vocal and said, "Paul, that's the vocal. Don't bring that one down." Or that's just my taste. If I was in a band with Paul, I'd be like, "That's the one, man. That's got the vibe." And I think, and I'm the same. The reason we work with other people is sometimes we don't know what we have. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But I think he definitely. He obviously does, but I think if I was in the studio with him and I was producing him that time, I was like, "That's the vocal. That's." That other vocal is great, but let's really kind of let's push this one up, And I think sometimes it's I think we're always, as musicians, sometimes we're trying to get away from what we always do. And I'm certainly, as a guitarist, or a musician, I'm always trying to move on. And sometimes you have to go, well, actually, you're quite good at that.
Right.
Or that's your strength. So maybe you should, don't be scared to use that, or don't be shy of using it.
Well, thank goodness we have other musicians to tell us that. Think of all the great stuff that would have been lost. I want to get into the degree to which, and don't let me push you where it might not be true, but the degree to which Radiohead might have at different points used the Beatles as a compass or as an example of what you can do. I've heard that A Day in the Life was kind of an influence on OK Computer going in, just in terms of what we're allowed to shoot for here.
I think the really dangerous thing is the thing that we were always aware of with the Beatles is never try and imitate, never try and go over that ground, because what they did was so unique. And don't get me wrong, I loved Oasis back in the day, but the bit that I find that we could never do was that bit when it was direct sort of reference of a Beatles track. It was just that's just no. I think what a band like Radiohead takes from the greatest band ever is that spirit of curiosity, that spirit of experimentation, using the studio as a laboratory, a sound laboratory, and looking at each album as a means of a moment in time, and not getting too hung up or focused about each record that you do. It's on to the next one. It's a full arc. It's a full journey. It's a full body of work. So it's very much for us, David Bowie and the Beatles, we were trying to follow their spirit. That kind of, let's do a U-turn after OK Computer. Let's do Kid A, where there are no guitars until track 4. That's the stuff that I think that's the spirit that the Beatles laid down, and people like Bowie picked up, and hopefully, we've carried on. That was what we continued with.
Well, you sure did, and incredibly successfully. One of the things that's amazing looking at it in 2021 is the incredible number of records that Radiohead sold while turning over the expectations of what a Radiohead record was. OK Computer sold tens of millions, but Kid A was the number one album and sold many millions, and that's one of the wildest records anybody ever made. It was almost the last moment. Radiohead kind of just got in under the door before the old distribution system collapsed.
Well, one of the best things anyone ever said was when that album came out, I did an interview with Billboard, and the guy said, the journo said, he said, "Ed, I got to tell you, I think it just gone to number one." He said, "I think this is the weirdest number one ever on Billboard." And I was just like, that is exactly that's the best compliment. That's kind of what we were always trying to do. And I think, what we're trying to do is that you get to a stage with your listenership that there was a trust. So that, for instance, I remember when we brought out OK Computer, people they wanted the Bends Part 2, which was our second record. And we were like, well, we've done that. And then it's that moment, isn't it? You don't get it necessarily immediately, but suddenly you have a eureka moment, third or fourth listen, you go, holy moly, this is it. And so using that was then the biggest step we made was to do the transition to Kid A. And I think we lost a lot of people there because people this is just too weird. But the people who got it, they were like, oh, okay, I see. This is the journey. We might not necessarily get it first. We might not get it 10th listen, but it's in there. And it's to build up that trust with the listenership, with your listener, to know that whatever you release, it comes from the heart, it comes from the soul. You might not get it at first, but hopefully you'll get it. It's trusting the band that they're gonna take you on a journey. And I think certainly, that was what I always loved. That the musicians and the bands that I cherish most took you on a journey like that, and you broadened your horizons.
Absolutely, and of course you have to deliver. I mean, that's the thing, is Sgt. Pepper delivered, the White Album delivered, Kid A delivered, In Rainbows delivered. It wasn't like Metal Machine music, not to insult the late, great Lou Reed, but it wasn't something we went, why are there four sides of this? As a guitar player, though, and I should say for anyone just tuning in, we're talking to Ed O'Brien of Radiohead on the Beatles Fab Forum. As a guitar player, was there a moment around the time of Kid A when you said, wait a minute, we're taking away the guitars? I have to figure out how to get in on this.
I got to be honest with you. It was a pretty dark time. I can laugh about it now, and I think it was a dark time for all of us. And it was quite hard. I mean, I was going through. I was sort of at the height of a depression. So the fact that guitars were being stripped away was really quite hard. However, it's like those moments in life when you have a crisis and you look at yourself, it's at those times often that you get most growth. And it made me think, suddenly I was just like, okay, I don't have the keyboard chops to play, synths and stuff. I can play 1-2 note stuff, but I love the physicality of the guitar. And we're also at an age when it's a golden age for foot pedals and sound manipulation. So I sort of really dug in and started thinking about the guitar in a different way. And that for me was from that crisis of what do I do came a whole other world opened up. And, I'm really thankful for that. And it forced me to, as a guitar player and as a musician, it takes the blinkers off and you suddenly realize that anything can be a sound source. Literally anything can be a sound source. And when you start thinking about a sound, it's a lot. It's just a lot richer. The whole thing it's got a lot more potential.
Now, speaking specifically of the Beatles and their influence on you, is the stuff you've continued to discover? I mean, no one who's not a host on the Fab Forum has listened to all the Beatles solo albums and B-sides and stuff. Are there things as you've gone along that you said, oh, I never really paid attention to this George Harrison record or this Paul McCartney project that he did in 1988 or something that you found later in life?
Yeah, it's funny because, I was very aware of, it's funny, my father was a big Beatles fan, as my mum. They're the same age as the Beatles, so grew up at the same time. And in terms of the solo careers, my dad was a big George Harrison fan on the solo career. So I remember one of the first albums we had was that Greatest Hits album where he's sitting on the front of his hot rod or whatever. So I knew, we had that, and that was on constant rotation. So I was sort of aware of George's stuff, not necessarily the albums so much. It's a funny time because when I get into music, so in the 80s, I was sort of, if you were coming from a sort of the post-punk thing, which I was, you didn't really pay much attention to their solo careers. I remember when John died, obviously Double Fantasy, the album was everywhere. And it was, I remember being so upset like the rest of the world, and, you know, starting over and all those songs, which was released actually, wasn't it? Before he died, before he was
sure. Yeah.
And I remember thinking, oh, it's a bit schlocky. It's a bit kind of, but then when he died, suddenly you realize, oh my God, there's so much emotion in these songs. I remember Woman being in tears as a kid, but I think I was more into stuff that was more, I don't know, more angular, if you like, the post-punk thing. My daughter had a big Michael Jackson phase when she was very young. And obviously, you know, say, the tracks that he did with Paul. And I remember thinking, oh, that's just top 40 stuff. That's not kind of what I was into. And we played it the other night. I'm like, oh my God, the back half of that song is a complete tune. It's like a dance-a-thon. It's like it needs a remix. So I think what happens as you get older, you get less judgmental. And rather than, I, as a classical teenager, I'm not really interested in what the Beatles, I was into what the Beatles did together. So, I guess my ears are more open now. I can't say I've discovered new stuff, because I think a lot of their stuff is just been everywhere all the time. But I've definitely heard things with less judgmental ears and gone, actually, that is amazing. And the sound of that is amazing. And I'd love to take that 16-bar loop and turn it into something else, you know.
Well, now that you've remixed McCartney successfully, I'm sure that he's open to suggestions. I know that you guys did strings for OK Computer at Abbey Road. Did Radiohead work at Abbey Road, or did you work at Abbey Road any other times?
Yeah, we worked at, we mixed on the Bends. We recorded for about a month in Studio 2 at Abbey Road. So we tracked in there. And then we mixed for a month in Studio 3 there. And then on OK Computer, we did the strings there. And we did some recording in 98 in Studio 2 again, The Room. And so, I got to be honest with you, we never really got on with Abbey Road. It's obviously a legendary place, but it was always a bit like, it wasn't, there was too much stuff, brilliant for strings, but if you're a band and you want to hunker on down, that's why we sort of got our own mobile stuff, so we could go to house and not have distractions. Or, Abbey Road, you got the canteen and stuff like that. It was all a bit kind of, 9 to 5-ish. So we never really got on with it. But I mean, that was just us being idiosyncratic, I guess.
Well, you're your own band. You're not, as you say, you're not Oasis. The Beatles, of course, started using the studio as an instrument fully when they stopped touring. I mean, there's a real dividing line in the middle of the Beatles between the touring years and the living in the studio years. Do you understand the temptation to that? Are there times when Radiohead uses the studio so deeply and so compellingly? Are there times when you go, well, I just don't want to pack it all up and go back on tour for a year and a half and slog around Germany or something?
Yeah, that's what we did. I mean, that's what we did. Kid A was exactly that. We basically, all the 3 albums previous that had been recording nonstop, and they were sort of things. Like when we made OK Computer, we stopped after 2 months and did another tour of America, essentially touring the Bends, but playing an OK Computer. And then we went back again after 2 months and did another tour of America. So when we got to Kid A, it was 18 months in the studio. But I think what's interesting is, and I recognize this whole thing, like, when they talk about the frustrations of why they went and played on the rooftop and let it be. And sometimes you can stay in the studio too long. And sometimes you need to go out there and just play, because studios are brilliant places for experimentation, but you want to get, and it's great to have that opportunity to go in there deep and do it. But sometimes it can be like navel gazing, and it can be too much. And you just want to be able to have the kind of release of just going out there and going, do you know what? Rather than having to get everything absolutely spot on, we're just going to play live. and play in front of an audience and warts and all. And so I think it's a process. By the end of a year, 18 months in the studio, you're really, really ready to go and play it to an audience. And sometimes what we've done, like when we made In Rainbows, we started recording and we did about 6 months recording, and it really wasn't very good. We hadn't got our chops up. And so we went out on tour for about 8 weeks, playing in these new songs, and then went back into the studio for about 9 months and recorded them. So, I think it's, you got to feel your way through. You got to feel your way through these things, because sometimes it feels appropriate to get deep in the studio, but other times it's just like, you know what, this is too much. We're all getting on one another's nerves. It's time to get out there and have some fun.
Yeah, well, I think that was McCartney's idea for the Beatles around the time of Let It Be, was, let's go out and do a huge show and go back on the road and get back to where we once belonged. We're talking to Ed O'Brien of Radiohead. You've been very, very generous with your time, Ed. I have to ask, your Radiohead's producer, Nigel Goodrich, did McCartney's album Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. Did you consult with him at all? Did you trade notes? Did you say, hey, I'm going to be working on a McCartney track, anything I should know?
No, not at all. Not at all. I remember him. I remember when he did that record, and him saying things like, "Oh man, his Hofner bass is amazing," or his Epiphone Casino is. He said. I remember Nigel saying. He said, "I got Paul to play the casino that he played, Paperback Writer on and stuff like that." But no, we didn't consult. It was just such a short, it was a very, very quick thing. And it's been right in the middle of lockdown as well. So studio time's been a limit. So it was like a real get in and get out job.
An action painting.
Yes, for sure.
Well, there's a million questions I could ask you, Ed, about Radiohead, but I know that's not our mission today. So I guess on the Beatles, I'll just ask you an essay question to finish, which is, being in one of the biggest and best bands of the last 30 years, is there anything the Beatles had that you envy?
Oh, wow. Gosh, I mean, well, where does one begin with this question? I mean, you have to say about the Beatles, they still are the greatest band. And it's interesting. I don't know what it's like for people out there listening to this or yourselves. I found this whole coronavirus era has been quite interesting. It's been like a real watershed for me in terms of, there's a lot of music I suddenly have gone like, do you know what, that I love? I never need to hear that again. I've had this strange, it's kind of like this sieving process, sorting the wheat out from the chaff. And I got to say, like when you hear the Beatles still, I introduced my wife to my mum's favorite Beatles track when I was growing up, which was I'll Follow the Sun off Beatles for Sale. And my wife was just like, she's like, oh my God, this is just extraordinary. And I think what's amazing, if there's one thing I don't know what we have. It's very difficult being in something to know what we have. But what I think the Beatles had in abundance was this kind of magic. And there's magic in the music. There's magic in the characters. The timing of it is magic. Rick Rubin, I heard Rick Rubin say, did you hear him saying about, he said, the Beatles are an example of for him of why he believes in God. And when you hear that, you go like, well, that's quite a big statement. But, there's something divine about them in a way. Like the story is like you're doing your show about them, and the music, it's absolutely extraordinary. This music of that era still resonates and still touches you. And there's something. So, I know that Radiohead, we play from the heart and soul, but I don't know in 50 years time or 40 years, 50 years time, 40 years time, will it still touch people? I don't know, but that would be the thing that I would hope for, that the Beatles will do forever. They will, my daughter has got 6 and she's 15. She's got 6 Beatles albums on vinyl. It's amazing. And she hasn't, I haven't force-fed her. I did playlists when they were young, but that's of her own choice. So I think that's the thing.
Let me ask you, because Ed O'Brien fans and Radiohead fans will want to know this. It's sort of as if you got stopped in your tracks just as Earth was coming out. Earth is the solo album from Ed O'Brien, or EOB. Once we are back in a more normal world, will you pick it up again and go back to it?
No, I think it's funny. I think I'm starting working on the second record. I'm in the writing process for that. What will happen is I get the second record out, and then we'll tour that and obviously do songs from Earth. But it's funny. It feels like a pre-COVID and a post-COVID, and I didn't. Yeah, it feels like another world. So the art will be as making those songs work with the new songs. So yeah, we'll once we recorded this new stuff, we'll go out on the road.
All right. Well, that's and your point earlier about sort of COVID being this line in the sand, and there's everything that happened before, and now there's everything that will happen after. It adds another perspective to what we are all experiencing. And then just for the Radiohead folks who've tuned in to get the little bit glimmer of Radiohead projects on the future, or repackaging of a classic album, and anything you can allow out there today?
There's no recording as such, but there's you know what these things are like. There's stuff afoot of revisiting a past record and putting it together and not reimagining it, but I have to, these things, I would love to be able to share it, but there'll be something later on in the year. So
that's as good as we could hope for. So thank you so much for spending time with us. There were some great things that you told us, and things for us to consider. And of course, the work that you've done on this new McCartney album, everybody should take a listen to it, and what you have done and sort of re-envisioned with a track from Paul McCartney III. To close things out, should we go back to your mom's favorite song and close our session with that, and ask you to be the disc jockey and introduce it on the Beatles channel? Would that be all right?
Yeah, that would be lovely. I'll Follow the Sun. I think it's interesting because Beatles for Sale obviously is a sort of it's a funny record, isn't it? Because it's got some of it's got Kansas City, it's got rock and roll music on it, it's got that rock and roll stuff, but it's also got, you can hear the move towards, say, Rubber Soul. And I think I'll Follow the Sun is it could actually be a track that could have been on Rubber Soul. And I think there's something about the voices, but also the Abbey Road reverb when they're using the chambers there. It's just a beautiful song. And it was my mum's favorite song. And if it's good enough for my mum, it's definitely good enough for me.